Thank you. I want to address my remarks first to the chairman and the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee. I think you've done a lot of hard work, and you've done something that, even though I'm not in the consensus, you've done what the Senate was designed to do, is build a consensus around a bill. And there's no question this bill will pass today, and so my congratulations to you, and my sincere thanks for some of the things that you put in the bill that we've been working on that are good government projects. So I just wanted to say that from the start. And I'm not going to talk specifically about the bill. I'm going to talk in bigger, broader terms of the problems that are facing us as a country. I have in my hands a book that contains $9 trillion worth of cuts. Not hardly anybody in the Senate read it. They may not agree with 50 or 60 or 70%. But there's certainly somewhere in here consensus for us to actually save a whole lot more money than what we're doing. In 2009, a young little lady by the name of Madeline showed up outside the Senate. And this is what she had draped around her. I'm already $38,375 in debt, and I only own a dollhouse. And since that period of time, we've managed to markedly change that situation for her to the worse. Because today, if she was outside, she'd have that sign around her neck, and it'd say $54,602, and she only owns a dollhouse. And the point I'm trying to make is this hole's getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And although I didn't vote for the budget agreement because I think it could have been done better, it was an agreement, and it had a consensus as well. So my criticism isn't that the members of this body forced a consensus, and which is exactly what the Senate's supposed to do. But I think as we've done these things, we might have lost sight of the big picture. And so I want to share with you for a minute what the big picture really looks like, because it is not pretty. According to generally accepted accounting principles, that's not the way we run the government, by the way. We don't use real accounting principles. We use all the tricks and smokes and mirrors we can. This number is indisputable. The unfunded liabilities for the federal government are $127 trillion. Think about that. We can't even imagine how much that is. Our national debt is $17.33 trillion as of last night. I checked it. There's 114 million households in America. If you take the federal liability per household, it comes out to $1.11 million. So $1,110,000 is what the debt plus the liability is for every family in this country. And it's growing. And I know we can't solve this problem over 1 year or 2 years. I'm so thankful the senator who is leading up the Appropriation Committee is in her position. I have the most wonderful respect for her. She's a listener. She wants to do right. But what we have to do is change the direction of this. It needs to go the other way. And that requires everybody. If you think about it, if the average family per capita income was, which is what it was last year in this country, $53,000, can you imagine how we're going to leverage and afford just the interest costs on $1,110,000? If you had 5% on $1 million, that's $55,000. That's more. Just the interest costs are more than the median family income in this country. So There are parts of this bill that are in front of us that I'm highly critical of. I don't like the fact that we play game with chimps, changes in mandatory programs. To me, it's not straightforward to the American people. It's not being honest about what we're actually doing. But what we're actually doing is digging the hole deeper. And let me just outline some things we could have done that we didn't do before we had the budget agreement and before we have this appropriation bill. The GAO over the last 3 years has identified about $250 billion that we could take a large portion of away just by eliminating duplication and by putting metrics on programs. Now think about that. That's $250 billion a year. So if we were to do that, and I've been out here and given speeches on all this and what everything's duplicative of, but the problem is the appropriate committees have not met to look at the GAO recommendations. They've not acted on them. They've not responded to them. The administration, and I'll give them credit, in their budgets the last few years, they've looked at those GAOs and made recommendations in their budgets for eliminations and consolidations. But we've essentially ignored it. And I know how tough it is to build a consensus in the Appropriations Committee that will get you the votes that you need to accomplish that. From the parochial concerns to the total budget concerns, I understand that. I'm glad we got a number now, and I'm glad you brought a bill that has a number. I think the number's too high if we're going to ever do anything about this. But the fact that we don't do anything that will really make a difference in the future in terms of driving this number down. Just think, if let's say the GAO's 50% right. Let's just say they're only 50% right. What if we consolidated, put metrics on programs and streamlined them as they recommend, and we saved $150 billion a year? That starts going in the right direction. It changes us. We start going in the right direction. Now think for a minute, if we have no recessions over the next 20 years and we have great economic growth at 4%, we still don't solve this problem because the interest costs are greater than the GDP growth associated with our country. So I wanted to give the background of why I come out here all the time and raise the issue of why we're stealing the future from our children. And nobody can deny the fact that we haven't done the work. The reasons that we haven't done the work are multiple, but most of it is we just won't do the work. And we don't have the leadership that requires us to do the work. Think about Madeline. Let's say she gets a great college education and is in the upper quintile in our country in terms of her earnings when she's 25. With normalized interest rates, she's going to fall behind. So I know we're talking out in the future, but one of the things Thomas Jefferson wanted out of the Senate was for us to be long-range thinkers. Not to think about the problem right now. Think about what the problem's going to be. And in my 9 years here, I have failed in my ability to convince my colleagues that we ought to be worried about this problem. Because the promise of America was opportunity. The promise of the poorhouse is no opportunity. And what we have set up for the average American family in the future is the poorhouse. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can fight among priorities, but the one thing we shouldn't be fighting about, the one thing that we should know that we can fix is Why would there be 679 different renewable energy programs? Can anybody give any possible justification for that? You know, it's just $15 billion a year, but if you consolidated them down to 20, you could save $5 billion a year. That's $50 billion over 10 years. Or why are there 253 different Department of Justice crime prevention grants? Each one of them has an overhead. And what we found when we studied it is people get a grant from one, and then use the same grant application to go to another grant overhead in DOJ, get the grant from another section, another program, for exactly the same claim. And the right hand doesn't know the left hand. If you consolidate them, one, you'd get more money to each individual grant, and number two is you wouldn't have the duplication, the fraud, and the lack of compliance that we know that these grant programs are loaded with. We've done the work. We've done the oversight. We've actually gone and studied them. Or why are there 209, think about this, science, technology, engineering, and math incentive programs, education programs, 13 different agencies, $3.5 billion a year. Why do we allow that to happen? Why do we allow? Here's the real face of who it's going to affect. And yet we won't do the hard work. And it's not the appropriator's job to do that work. I understand that. But one of the things that appropriators could do is saying, we're not going to fund any of these programs unless you consolidate them and put metrics on them. So if you expect it to come out in March, and I'm so happy that the chairman wants to run the appropriation bills to get back to normal, but to say, Judiciary Committee, if you want these justice grant programs run, consolidate them, put metrics on them, streamline them, and send them to us, and then we'll fund them. If you don't, so everybody will know, we're appropriating a year about $480 billion worth of money for programs that aren't authorized at all. So one of the strengths of the Appropriation Committee could be that you could put some demands on the Authorizing Committee to clean this stuff up. Let me just give you a couple more. Healthcare has been in the news. How many of us realize that we have 91 different healthcare training programs spending $14 billion a year? None of my colleagues probably know that. But in the Committee of Jurisdiction, they've done nothing about it. And so I don't object to spending $14 billion on health training programs or any of these other things, as long as we're doing it wisely. And what I would suggest to you, 91 different programs, which should be probably 4 or 5, and the overhead associated with the others is saved to the American public, that we could save a significant amount of money for Madeline. Because the real story is our excesses, our lack of work, our lack of consolidation, our lack of streamlining, our lack of elimination, duplication, our lack of demanding metrics so that we know that the programs that we're out there funding are working. We're not going to pay the price for it. Nobody in this room. The people who are going to be paying the price for it is Madeline's generation. And how are they going to pay for that price? What's going to happen? What's the real cost associated with that? It's not a pretty picture. Here's what it is. It's a markedly declining standard of living. Most people don't know that median family incomes in real dollars in America today is at the exact same level it was in 1989. And it's going backwards, even with a growing economy. It's going backwards. So the assets available to a family are declining while the obligations for that family are increasing. And we're responsible for that. And it's not something that we can't fix, it's something that we choose not to fix. I also would say that I have one large concern in this bill. We increased NIH back up $1 billion. We're still not where we were 2 years ago. But we started with $800 million more at the Defense Department, duplicating programs that are already running at the NIH. So you're making my list bigger, not smaller. We're going in the wrong direction. We have great people at the NIH. We've got a great leader in Francis Collins. They've markedly improved their management of their grants, their oversight of their grants. And we're going to take $800 million and move it over to another set of overhead with people not nearly as experienced, not nearly as knowledgeable. And we're going to be spending money in the Defense Department to study things that we're spending money, the exact same type of thing, at NIH. So we're not going to get great value for this money. What we're going to do is waste it. And what that $800 million should have done is should have gone to NIH. And every other non-military related medical program over there, that money should have gone to NIH. And when you talk to the senators that started this, both Tom Harkin and our former colleague, now deceased, Ted Stevens, they'll admit to you in private that it was a mistake to ever start it this way. Because we're wasting a ton of precious dollars that could be used to save somebody's life. But somebody has a reason for that. I don't know what it is. But I'll tell you, in this bill, you got $68 billion of appropriations for the Defense Department that have nothing to do with the defense of this country. Now, you don't get all those savings if you take it out of the Defense Department. But you get $3 or $4 billion if you take it out of the Defense Department. And that $3 or $4 billion could fund the NIH back at a level that it should be funded, or could protect Madeline from further decline in her standard of living. So I've made my point. I understand my perspective is not in the majority. But I'll guarantee you my perspective is in the majority of Americans. That we ought not to have 679 renewable energy initiatives. I don't think you'd find anybody in the country who would disagree with me on that. That they ought to be consolidated. They ought to be run efficiently. They ought to have metrics on them. And as well as the other hundreds of sets of duplications. We're going to get another report next month from the GAO, actually in March. It'll be their fourth. And they're so discouraged because they do all this hard work and they make recommendations and then we sit on them. We don't act. And so if I were to have a challenge to my colleagues, is first of all, read the reports over the last 4 years and look at the data that shows where we're really wasting money. And then, please, for Madeline and her generation's sake, act on it. Don't ignore it. I know it's not easy work, it's hard work. I've done oversight for 9 years here. But it can be done, it should be done, and the Madelines of America are worth it. I yield the floor.